powerful testimony a moment ago. You know, I will say something Mr. Walters said a minute ago I think is powerfully correct as I travel both the state of Texas and the country. I am stopped by police officers almost on a daily basis who express to me one after the other that they feel they're under assault. I cannot tell you the frequency with which individual officers in cities all over the country say, thank you for standing up for me. That sentiment is being felt, and it's being felt powerfully. You know, there's been some suggestion that there has not been a vilification of law enforcement. And I think that suggestion is counter to the facts and counter to the evidence. Indeed, you go back to 2009. President Obama was newly elected, and you had an incident with a Harvard professor. And President Obama, who I might note, was not there in Cambridge, Massachusetts, did not know what the facts were. But even not knowing what the facts were, the president saw fit to say, quote, "The Cambridge police acted stupidly." I, for one, don't think the President of the United States ought to be insulting police officers for, quote, acting stupidly, when the President, by his own admission, doesn't know the facts of what occurred. That started to set the stage for beginning with the assumption police officers are guilty until proven innocent. President Obama, in 2014 at the United Nations, stood in front of the world and held up law enforcement in a negative way. He said, "I realize that Americans' critics will be quick to point out that at times we too have failed to live up by our ideals, that America has plenty of problems within its own borders." This president has made a pattern of describing what he thinks are America's problems and doing it in front of foreign nations. He continued, "This is true. In a summer marked by instability in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, I know that the world also took notice of the small American city of Ferguson, Missouri, where a young man was killed and a community was divided." President Obama in front of the United Nations comparing the police officers to terrorists in the Middle East. And let's be clear, he is giving his opinion on that. A young man was killed. We have failed to live up to our ideals. Those are President Obama's words. This is true. We have failed to live up to our ideals. This is true. He is rendering judgment and verdict. I would note the grand jury in Ferguson disagreed with President Obama. The actual people our Justice Department charges with reviewing the evidence, something that doesn't seem to trouble President Obama when he's opining law enforcement must be in the wrong. The grand jury that reviewed the evidence concluded to the contrary, but President Obama goes in front of the United Nations and lambasts police officers. You don't think that message is heard by police officers throughout the country? In 2015, President Obama said, "There are some police who aren't doing the right thing." Rather than close ranks, he said, some police chiefs have recognized they've got to get their arms around the problem. But President Obama continued, "We can't just leave this to the police." It's important to understand, he doesn't think the police can govern themselves. Instead, President Obama is saying, I think there are police departments that have to do some soul searching. I think there's some communities that have to do some soul searching. But I think as a country, we have to do some soul searching. This is not new. It's been going on for decades. The president standing as judge and jury convicting police officers. In response to his own FBI director, Mr. Comey, President Obama, speaking right after Mr. Comey, stands up and says, "We do have to stick with the facts. What we can't do is cherry pick or use anecdotal evidence to drive policy or feed political agendas." How about what we can't do is have the President of the United States impugning the integrity? Is he suggesting the director of the FBI is cherry-picking data? It's not an implicit suggestion, it is an explicit suggestion. In the summer of 2014, the Department of Justice, targeting the Seattle Police Department, said in writing that the officers were engaged in, quote, discriminatory practices subconsciously. I'm very pleased to know that the U.S. Department of Justice have now become psychiatrists, have now become mystics delving into the subconscious. How about the Department of Justice enforce the laws instead of worrying about the deep subconscious of police officers, which the President has already told us apparently they're acting stupidly anyway? We've talked about the President nominating for a senior Department of Justice position a lawyer who not only voluntarily and for free represented an admitted cop killer, but lionized him, held him out as a cause celeb. But you know, that's not the only cop killer that the administration has turned a blind eye to. We should all remember Joanne Chesimard. Now, who is Joanne Chesimard? Joanne Chesimard, she's on the FBI most wanted list. She is wanted for escaping from prison in Clinton, New Jersey, while serving a life sentence for murder. On May 2nd, 1973, Chesimard, who was part of the revolutionary extremist organization known as the Black Liberation Army, and two accomplices were stopped for a motor vehicle violation on the New Jersey Turnpike by two troopers with the New Jersey State Police. At the time, Ms. Chesimard was wanted for her involvement in several felonies, including bank robbery. Chesimard and her accomplices opened fire on the troopers. One trooper was wounded and another was shot and killed, execution shot style at point-blank range. Chesimard fled the scene but was subsequently apprehended. One of her accomplices was killed in the shootout, and the other was also apprehended and remains in jail. In 1977, Chesimard was found guilty of first-degree murder, assault and battery of a police officer, assault with a dangerous weapon, assault with intent to kill, illegal possession of a weapon, and armed robbery. She was sentenced to life in prison. On November 2nd, 1979, Chesimard escaped from prison and lived underground before being located in Cuba in 1984. She's still living in Cuba. We were all given the pleasing situation of seeing President Obama and John Kerry and the Obama administration embracing apparently our newfound friends, Raul Castro and Fidel Castro, cruel communist dictators. You know, in the whole course of opening this rapprochement with Cuba, in the whole course of opening an American embassy in Cuba, in the whole course of opening a Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C., in the whole course of the State Department silencing Cuban dissidents in Washington, D.C., did the Obama administration ever once say of their new communist buddies, how about you hand over the cop killer living in Cuba? If you're going to be part of this community of nations, if we're going to embrace Cuba in a way that will make every leftist faculty lounge in America cheer, how about as the tiny price of that, you hand over a cop killer instead of shielding someone who murdered a New Jersey state trooper in cold blood execution style? Does anyone in their right mind think that the Obama administration ever even once mentioned that? You want to know why the cops feel thrown overboard? Because nobody would suggest they would even think to say, hand over the cop killer. You know, it's not an accident that at Deputy Goforth's funeral, President Obama was nowhere to be found. It's not an accident that at funeral after funeral of police officers who've been murdered, targeted, singled out for defending their communities, that President Obama is nowhere to be found. There is a consequence when you vilify, when you demonize, when you hold out for contempt the good men and women who protect our communities. Of course, there can be individuals who violate the law, and we have a justice system. If there is an individual in law enforcement who violates the law, we have a justice system to handle that. But this president, this Department of Justice, has not approached it saying, let's enforce the law. They've started with the assumption that law enforcement is, as they said to the Seattle Police Department, subconsciously discriminating. They're guilty. And we've seen the consequences. We've seen crime rising. We've seen homicides rising. We've seen black lives being lost over and over and over again, being murdered. It is wrong. And I believe it should end. Senator Coons.